All right. Well, my pleasure today to introduce Holly Campbell. Holly is a public service assistant with the University of Georgia Warnell School of Forestry and Natural Resources. And there she focuses on community forestry and wildland fire outreach education and undergraduate instruction. Ms. Campbell is also part of the faculty team of a new Warnell degree program in community forestry and arboriculture, which launched in fall of 2019. Among other interests in community forestry, Ms. Campbell seeks to educate the public and professionals about soil protection during construction, increased soil volume to urban trees, and the importance of urban soil health and quality to support tree health. Ms. Campbell has a BSA in horticulture and an MS in forest resources, where she focused on soil science research. Prior to being an educator, Ms. Campbell was a landscape gardener for over 10 years, focusing on soil health, wildlife attracting gardens, and perennial fruit production. And her email address, hollycam@uga.edu. As a firm believer in the fundamental importance of healthy soils, I'm really looking forward to hearing what Ms. Campbell can tell us. Holly, it's all yours.
Okay, well, before I get started, making sure everyone can still hear me, you can give me the thumbs up, Joran, and make sure that my slide is showing.
Indeed, indeed. 2 thumbs up.
Excellent. Okay, well, I am so excited to be here and be linked in some way to New Mexico. New Mexico holds a really special place in my heart, and I was really disappointed that the ISA International Conference didn't occur there because I was so excited to go out again. I used to live in Durango, and while I lived there, I traveled a lot down into New Mexico, explored some natural hot springs up in Taos, went down to hot springs in Truth or Consequences, hiked in the Gila National Forest, just had a really nice experience exploring the state. It's a lovely place. So I am glad I've had that in my lifetime. So in this presentation today, I'm going to review some important soil processes and how they affect or are impacted by conditions in urban and suburban environments. And the second part of the presentation is going to focus on a few of the many urban soil management recommendations that support community tree growth and health. So full disclosure, I'm going to preface here, though I did quite a bit of research on New Mexico soils for this presentation, I in no way claim to be an expert on any kind of state or local conditions beyond what I researched. So fortunately, many of the urban and suburban soil challenges are similar across metropolitan areas. So my presentation will focus more on these general recommendations with some focus on some specific New Mexico soil conditions. So I do want to say today is Georgia Arbor Day. So I want to put a shout out to that. It's nice to give this presentation on our state's Arbor Day. Also, I would like to dedicate my presentation to a dear friend of mine, a colleague, and my former graduate advisor, soil scientist Dr. Larry Morris. Some of you may know him. He unfortunately is battling advanced stage cancer. And so Dr. Morris shared several of his graphics with me for some of the slides that you'll see today and really inspired my interest and love of soil. So raise a glass to Larry Morris. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Okay, so this has probably been repeated across several presentations, but as many of us know, our urban and suburban communities present several environmental, economic, and social challenges, including many of these on the slide, and all sorts of different types of pollution, social challenges, and also looking at health challenges and well-being challenges and some environmental challenges that we associate with urban areas. And as many of us are also aware of and have likely heard throughout the conference, that trees have been shown repeatedly to mitigate many of these challenges. And so they play a really important role in our communities. So trees require several inputs and outputs to grow and be healthy, much like ourselves. And trees need water from precipitation, as we know, and groundwater to carry out. So they use groundwater as well, but both of these carrying out essential process of photosynthesis. They require gases like carbon dioxide to assist leaves and sometimes stems in photosynthesizing to make those vital carbohydrate foods, and they require oxygen to respire. Trees also need photons from the sun to drive photosynthesis. The sun also interacts with the earth to influence things like seasons, weather, climate, and more, and these all impact trees. Trees require nutrients to carry out basic functions. For example, P, or phosphorus, is part of the building blocks of chromosomes and genes, helping deliver the genetic code from one generation of a plant to the next. So potassium, or K, as we see on the screen here, controls opening and closing the stomata of plants, allowing in CO2, again supporting photosynthesis. Trees also need structure, which I have pictured here, and they need something to grow in and room to grow. Trees require other things as well, like fungal partnerships, microbes and soil animals, support for reproduction, and more. And other than solar energy and abundance of CO2, soils provide or support these important requirements for tree growth and health. So for this reason, soil plays an essential role in a tree's life. All right, so roots are the primary connection between services that soils provide and what trees require. And these services are listed in this dotted yellow box here. And we just went over some of those. So 90% of tree roots occur in the top 20 inches of soil, though most are usually found 12 inches below the soil surface. Tree roots are far shallower and have more lateral or horizontal growth than most people think. Most people think this is what tree roots look like, but this is inaccurate. And more so, the large diagram that's here on the slide approximate normal root spread and growth. And this is sort of demonstrating to you, and this is just one example, this varies, but their roots can grow between 2 to 3 times the canopy diameter as they're mining for water and nutrients. So there's 3 different types of roots. There's fine roots, structural roots, and the root plate. Fine roots, which you can't really see in this diagram very well, but they're fibrous and they're small and they're numerous and they're very short-lived. Fine roots partner with soil mycorrhizae, and they're responsible for nutrient and water uptake in the tree, and they also help anchor the tree. The large structural roots are largest in diameter close to the tree, and they sort of become narrower in diameter as they grow away from the tree. Structural roots are primarily involved in transporting water and nutrients, anchoring the tree, and also carbohydrate storage. The root plate is a rigid structure and this is the connection between the stem of the tree and the main root system. And it's really responsible for anchoring the tree, allowing for some movement or a rocking motion during wind, but really keeping the stem and the canopy upright. Damage to or restriction of root growth affects the health and the stability of the tree, as you can imagine. So again, trees require what's in this yellow dotted box for optimal growth and health, but the reality for tree roots in urban and suburban settings is often less than ideal. So the images on this slide are exactly what can happen in urban and suburban areas. Yes, these images are definitely Georgia, in a Georgia or southeastern environment. So look at some of the images on the slide to see typical examples of insufficient root soil volume, root damage, poor drainage, et cetera, et cetera. So for example, the tree in the lower left image had to be removed due to structural root damage during construction. This tree actually started leaning towards the house. So they were doing sort of road or sidewalk construction here, and it strongly affected the structure and the support and anchoring of this tree. So rooting areas can also have insufficient drainage. We have this in the lower right image. They can also have soil pollution added to them in urban areas, which I don't have pictured here. And lastly, an existing or potential rooting area can be compacted by heavy equipment and even foot traffic. So heavy equipment here, foot traffic, insufficient soil volume, root damage. We've seen a lot of this. So let's explore it in a little more depth, a few ways that soils are disturbed and how this influences tree growth and health. All right, so what does a healthy undisturbed soil, quote unquote, look like? An undisturbed soil can be found in a forest, grassland, or other natural setting, and that can be sort of approximated or demonstrated in this image here on the left. So an undisturbed soil has several characteristics, including large and small pores, organic matter, and soil aggregates. Now, an ideal undisturbed soil contains approximately 45% soil particles, which is the mineral part of the soil. So it's comprised of chemically or physically weathered rock. Ideally, this soil also contains about 50% pore space. And ideally, that pore space will be about 25% air and 25% water. Lastly, a healthy undisturbed soil will contain about 5% organic matter. So let's examine this diagram to the right. So large pores hold water and air and allow water drainage and air movement, especially through these connected pores here. So in these large pores, water is drained through by gravity, and these large pores also provide a sort of a surface for soil animals and soil microbes to populate. So small pores also hold water and air and provide habitat for microorganisms. However, some of the water held in these small pores, such as in clay soils that we have here in Georgia, can become unavailable to plants. And we won't go into a lot of detail, but just a brief explanation. This is really because the force of those small pores holding the water is stronger than gravity and also stronger than the pressure that the roots can form to extract that water from the plant. So an undisturbed soil also has a range of particle sizes, as we see here. And these particle sizes can form aggregates. They can be cemented together, and these aggregates help form pores that we see in this diagram, and they also provide soil structure and support. So lastly, as many of you are likely familiar, organic matter is a source of nutrients. It's primarily a source of nutrients for microorganisms, but those microorganisms and soil animals make the nutrients available to plants. All right, so let's move on to an example of a disturbed soil. So a disturbed soil, on the other hand, limits optimal tree health and growth, especially in the way that affects tree roots. Soil compaction is one type of soil disturbance that we're going to discuss over a few slides. So soil compaction, as you see here, is simply the compression of a volume of soil, and it's sort of the downward pressure on the soil, and it modifies pore space, size, and distribution. And remember, as we've talked about several times, these pores need to facilitate water and gas movement for plant growth and health. So a modification of these pores makes it more difficult to diffuse gases and move water in and out of the soil. Because again, the large pores are responsible for that movement. So soils are compacted at the surface from foot traffic. We saw a few slides ago, and then at depth by heavy equipment. And soils are more compacted more easily when they're wet. So it's harder to compact the soil when it's dry as opposed to when it's wet. Compaction also increases something called soil strength by making it more difficult for roots to grow into it. We're going to talk about that in a few slides. So one way to measure the degree of a soil's compaction is by measuring bulk density. Bulk density is the weight of a soil in a given volume, and it's measured in grams per centimeter cubed. So bulk density can determine if there's been a reduction in the percentage of soil pore volume, and which we're hoping will be ideally 50%. So bulk density is an indicator of soil porosity or soil space. And bulk density values vary depending on soil texture or whether a soil has more clay, silt, or sand. So let's imagine that the two soils in this diagram above are the same soil texture. Let's just say a silty clay loam. The undisturbed soil on the left has a bulk density of 1.32 grams per centimeter cube. That's actually a really good bulk density. And the bulk density of the disturbed or compacted silty clay loam here is 1.6 grams per centimeter cube. So what does this mean? So these are occupying the same volume of soil, and the bulk density of the compacted soil has a larger portion of its volume occupied by the mineral soil as opposed to the pore space. So there's a decrease in pore space. So bulk density value increases with compaction. Bulk density also tends to increase with depth in the soil. So this slide contains some different values here. We have ideal, marginal, and restrictive values based on soil texture, which we have listed here. And you'll see that the ideal value for a sandy soil can be much higher than it is for loam or clay soils. So soil texture must be known to analyze a bulk density measurement as ideal or restrictive. So look at the values on the table. For example, we had on our last slide, we were talking about a silty clay loam. So let's look at these values, and we have right here. So the undisturbed soil had a bulk density of 1.32 grams per centimeter cubed, which we see is within that ideal range. And the compacted silty clay loam had a bulk density measurement of 1.60, which you can see is between the marginal and restrictive layer. Restrictive meaning restricted to root growth, water, and air infiltration. So bulk density is a great indicator of soil quality, which is really the capacity for a soil to function within managed and natural systems. So it's a great measurement for indicating soil quality for community trees. Let's explore a bit more detail on why water drainage to the soil is so important for plants. So this slide's demonstrating how the amount of water occupying soil pores influences oxygen entering the soil. And as you can imagine, if more of the soil pore space is filled with water, less of it can allow for gas movement in and out of the soil. Again, tree roots need oxygen, and they need the soil to release carbon dioxide back into the environment. So this occurs through those interconnected, mostly large pores. So tree roots also need water, but most trees need it eventually to drain away and not lead to the tree having wet feet, which can create an oxygen poor environment. Okay, so what we have here with this graph, we have our, on this axis our pores. And so on this end of the axis, the pores are 100% full of water, so they're saturated. And as the pores start to dry out and they're moving towards almost completely dry, then we have more air, obviously, than we have water, a lot more. And then on this axis, we have oxygen diffusion into the soil. And as we see, as the soil pores begin to dry out, that there's more and more oxygen diffusion into the soil. And so we don't want to create this oxygen poor environment. So compacted soils contain fewer large pores that really allow for this efficient drainage of water. And so compacted soils have a more difficult time draining water and getting needed oxygen to the tree roots. Soil strength is the mechanical resistance of soil to failure. So soil strength increases as the soil becomes drier, but also as it becomes compacted. And it really limits root growth depending on the degree of strength. So soil strength is another way to measure soil compaction, and it greatly impacts root growth by affecting the ability of roots to grow into or penetrate the soil. So soil strength can be measured with an instrument called a cone penetrometer. Some of you may have used this before. So let's just talk about how roots grow. So roots grow primarily in two different ways. The root tip diameter is going to try to grow into channels in the soil that are larger than the diameter of that root tip. And then roots also will grow into small pores in the soil that they generate pressure to grow into. So they have to exert some force to get into those small pores. So in this figure, which is adapted from this research by Taylor and Barr, Ingration and Sands, root growth and soil strength on two plants are examined. So on this axis, we have soil strength that's measured in pressure, and it's PSI on the lower level, and then megapascals here on this higher range. So we have two different measurements here for pressure. And then on this axis, we're looking at root penetration, or the ability for the roots to penetrate the soil. These studies are looking at two plants, cotton and pine. And as we see, as the soil strength increases, or the soil is becoming drier or more compacted, the ability of these plants' roots to penetrate the soil decreases and primarily stops at 2 megapascals or 290 psi. So an overall summary of the graph is that roots have to work considerably harder in compacted soil or high soil strengths. And eventually roots just stop growing when the soil strength is too high. So how do we deal with these tree roots with compacted soil? It's a great question. So trees growing in heavily compacted soils tend to have root growth confined near the surface or areas not compacted. They're going to find that soil. And high soil strength in compacted soils can limit tree establishment. It can cause distorted root growth, and if occurring suddenly around mature trees, can lead to root mortality and canopy dieback. And we're going to talk about this more when we get into the recommendations. So this figure examines soil strength of an undisturbed soil and a soil strength of a soil on a construction site that's been compacted. And it has both surface and deep compaction. And the surface compaction likely occurred from people walking across the site, and the deep compaction was from heavy equipment. So again, on this axis, we are looking at pressure. This PSI, and kilopascals is 1,000 megapascals. So again, we're looking either 2 megapascals or 2,000 kilopascals. It's this root limiting value. And then on this axis, we're looking at the depth in the soil, which is centimeters here. And then I put a little inches value at about 30 centimeters is about 12 inches. So we see that the undisturbed soil, we see the pressure here. These values are from a cone penetrometer, and we see that they are mostly underneath this root limiting value here. And then in the compacted soil, you can see that this soil is way above what tree roots or other plants can grow in. And this is a common scenario for plants post-construction and what they're expected to grow into. And we see that this soil needs to be ameliorated in order for trees to have good growth and health. So soil crusts can occur on exposed soils and are problematic because they restrict soil aeration and water movement into and out of the soil. Soil crusts are a few millimeters up to 2 inches thick and can occur over a large area. So soil crusts are caused by a few different factors. Crusts form when a soil is exposed to rainfall or irrigation, and it's really the force of these large water drops that breaks up the structure of the soil. And what happens is that small soil particles like silt and clay move into the pores of the soil, and they create that kind of continuous crust layer. So, crusting can also occur from freeze-thaw effects on soils that have high shrink swell potential. And it also forms in soils that occur in arid and semi-arid regions like New Mexico, where there is a high saline or salt content in the soil. Now, compared to where I live, New Mexico is dry. It also has a different geologic history, and therefore our soils are different. So precipitation, temperature, parent rocks that form soil, time, and more factors really impact soil formation and characteristics. So I'll do a little comparison to get us thinking about how climate and other factors affect soils in New Mexico. Okay, so where I live, Georgia, receives on average about 50 inches of rainfall a year. New Mexico, on the other hand, is warm and dry and receives on average 14 inches a year. And this varies between 6 to 27 inches depending on where you are in the state, the elevation, and the location. So Georgia has a very warm and humid climate as opposed to a warm and dry climate. Our geology consists primarily of felsic metamorphic rocks, which occur in a large part of the state, and these rocks tend to develop more acidic soils. Other than along the coastal plains, our Piedmont mountain soils have been leached heavily over hundreds of thousands of years, a process which transforms our soils into being more clay-rich, deep in many areas acidic, it's lower in nutrients and other features. And so you see these types of soils around the world. New Mexico has varying elevations which influence temperature and precipitation, and also rocks of different geologic ages, including limestone. So precipitation helps break down certain minerals in the soil, and it transforms them, and the rain moves these minerals deeper into the soil profile. Precipitation also alters the pH of the soil because water, or H2O, when it combines with carbon dioxide, it forms carbonic acid, which helps acidify the soil. So due to low rainfall, New Mexico soils tend to have a higher pH since minerals like the pH calcium carbonate that can form this hardened caliche layer that many of you are probably much more familiar with than I am, that the rainfall isn't dissolving with the carbonic acid. It's not dissolving those minerals and not moving them deeper into the profile. So it affects the pH, having a higher pH around a tree's root zones. Also, lower precipitation combined with higher evaporation from the soil can lead to an accumulation of salts. And these mineral salts can be harmful to plants. And in a drier climate as well, you can have less plant growth, meaning you're having less organic matter input, either under the soil through the roots or above the soil through leaf fall. So So lastly, due to climate and geology, soil texture in New Mexico can vary greatly. And in the research I was doing, it shows that you have sandy soils, silty soils, clay soils. We have a variation as well, but it seems like the variation is pretty great across New Mexico. So the availability of nutrients in a large part is influenced by pH of the soil. And this is where nutrients are more or less available based on pH. A slightly acid pH increases nutrient availability, and so most plants prefer the pH to be in this range from optimal nutrient access. And so the shaded green bar on this slide contains that range as being between about 6 and 7. Urban soils trend towards more basic, alkaline, or high pH, and urban soil pH is highlighted by this pink bar here. And this higher pH occurs sometimes just from pollution to the soil. So it can be calcium carbonate debris like drywall, calcium and lime and concrete, pesticides, salts, boron, fertilizers, those can all affect the pH. Higher pH leads to some nutrient deficiencies, and in urban areas, a common nutrient deficiency we'll see is iron chlorosis, which is here. So New Mexico soil pH, as we just mentioned, varies across the state and even varies within a soil profile. I was surprised by the range. So the range here is in this blue bar. It can be anywhere from 6.5 to over 8.4. But overall, as mentioned, New Mexico soil pH trends towards alkaline or having a higher pH. And this can be due to that calcium carbonate, high sodium content, but also due to that low precipitation that we were talking about earlier that helps dissolve and transport nutrients in the soil. Older soils may have flushed some of the calcium below the topsoil, and so the pH in the upper part of the topsoil may be more favorable for plant growth in the rooting zone. But when you have these higher pH soils, you're going to start to see some of these what are sort of faults deficiencies, because these minerals may actually be in the soil, they just can't be accessed because of the pH. So phosphorus, iron, and boron deficiency will start to show up in higher pH soils. So we talked about caliche, and I may not be saying that right. Caliche is formed when calcium and magnesium carbonate cement together. It can be a really thick or a thin layer and may occur at varying depths in the soil. It typically has a high pH, as you can imagine, the calcium carbonate. So it can affect that nutrient availability we just talked about on the last slide. It also can form this hardened layer that limits the downward movement of water. And in that hardened layer can restrict root growth and the roots mining for nutrients. And it can also make soils susceptible to erosion if they're not covered with some kind of plant cover or mulch. And I wanted to talk briefly about salinity in soils. So mineral salts, we've talked about this a little bit already, are naturally occurring, and many are essential plant nutrients. But salts originate from rock-based minerals and are also added to the soil through irrigation and mineral-rich irrigation waters. Rocks formed in marine sediments or marine deposits can have elevated levels of sodium, whereas other types of rocks yield other mineral salts. So salts accumulate and concentrate over time in soils, and they can occur in areas where precipitation is low and evaporation is high. Also, transpiration can be high as well, and this does occur in New Mexico. So there are two main types of saline soils that present challenges to tree health and growth. We have saline soils and sodic soils. So saline soils have this exchangeable sodium, so sodium elements in the soil attaching to the soil particles. They have less than 15% of this exchangeable sodium. Saline soils will also limit water uptake and can present sort of drought symptoms in the plants because they're preventing the plant from taking up water due to the quantity of the salts in the soil. And this can lead to reduced growth and transpiration of the plant. And it needs to be measured in the soil through a soil test, and it's called EC, or electrical conductivity. It's a test that you would want to look for. So also in sodic soils, these are high sodium salt soils where the exchangeable sodium is greater than 15%. There's a lot of problems associated with this soil. So it breaks the soil structure apart. It forms these hard salt crusts that can lead to all sorts of problems with water and air infiltration, cause a lot of sensitivity symptoms in plants. And it can occur in really high pH soils or support high pH soils, which are not great for nutrient availability. And then lastly, we talked about that New Mexico soils can be low in organic matter just because of a drier climate. And I just wanted to briefly go over some of these features of organic matter. And this is actually a soil series in New Mexico that does have a nice organic matter content in its A horizon or topsoil. So organic matter adds a lot to the soil, and it adds a lot to the structure of the soil. And when the structure of the soil is modified in a great way, it creates better pore space. So we have increased water and air infiltration. We also have increased water holding capacity of soils with added organic matter. When organic matter can add these exchange sites, so it helps hold nutrients in the soil, but also the organic matter provides nutrients to the soil. It also tends to what's called buffer the soil, so it prevents these kind of drastic changes in pH that can occur in the soil, and then it helps lower the soil pH. So we'll talk about that in the recommendations. Speaking of, let's get to the recommendations that I wanted to go over in this presentation. So we're going to go over just a few. I'm not going to cover everything just for the sake of time. But really, we're trying to get to having healthy soils equaling healthy trees, as opposed to unhealthy soils supporting unhealthy trees. So there's one thing that I want to go over first, and many of you are probably familiar with this. It's called the critical root zone. I'm going to reference this several times. So the critical root zone includes a lot of the root plate and a lot of the structural roots and many of the fine roots. It's a really important part of the tree's structure and stability, and also nutrient and water holding nutrient and water seeking abilities and uptake abilities. And so this area is often recommended to be protected, especially in construction. And so the critical root zone is measured by measuring the tree at diameter breast height, which is also called DBH. It's measured at about 4.5 feet above the soil surface on the trunk, and you're looking at the diameter in inches of the tree. And so the way that you measure the critical root zone, which is sort of this area here, is that you want to measure that diameter, and then for each diameter of the trunk of the tree, you want to multiply it by 1.5 feet. Now, some people use a figure of 1 or 1.25, but I like going with the 1.5 feet, protecting more of the soil if possible. And so, for example, I have an example here, and a 20-inch diameter tree multiplied by 1.5 feet is a 30-foot critical root zone. Now, this is the radius, so we're talking about 30 feet out from one side of the tree. And so just keep this in mind as we move forward in looking at the recommendations. This is sort of this critical root zone that we're trying to protect or work within. All right, so let's get back to compaction. This is one of the first recommendations. So one of the most common conditions community trees face is soil compaction. And as mentioned earlier, soil compaction occurs in the surface soil and the subsoil. So we're going to have two different types of recommendations. And there's several techniques that you can use at both depths. My preferred technique for addressing soil compaction is air spading, also known as air tillage and mulching. So air spading is a compressed air power tool that removes or loosens soil around a tree without damaging the fragile roots. And it's usually used within the critical root zone. And the air spade is really excellent for reducing compaction. It needs to be performed when the soil is at field capacity. So field capacity is when excess water is drained from the soil and the soil contains a mixture of air and water. So, but there's still moisture in the soil. And this usually occurs maybe 2 to 3 days after a rain or after irrigation use. So when you're using air tillage and working around an area of the tree, you can add compost and even topsoil and then till that in and reapply it around the tree. We have an image here of air tillage. So usually you only want to work in small sections around the tree. You don't want to do the whole area around the tree, just not to disturb the roots too much, but it can be performed over several years. Air spading can be a little bit costly and it's somewhat labor intensive, but it has a lot of benefits, as I just went over, but it's also helpful if there's an area where you need sort of almost a full soil replacement. This is a safe way to kind of remove that soil and replace it with a better soil. And air spading can be used around younger and mature trees. So mulching involves adding a variety of soil organic amendments. This could be like shredded leaves, wood mulch, straw, and compost. And each of these amendments is going to add organic matter, which has the benefits we talked about earlier. And mulch should be added in about a 2 to 4 inch layer and kept always 4 to 6 inches away from the trunk of the tree. So mulch should be added annually. And sometimes it can form sort of a water impermeable layer. So each year that you're adding it, you may have to rake back the original mulch just to break up that water impermeable layer and reapply it. I especially like hardwood mulch. It adds a lot of carbon to the soil and it's just really great for soil structure. And mulches obviously can be used around young and older trees. So I have another technique here called vertical mulching, which is listed here or pictured here. And it entails digging or air spading holes in a grid pattern to about an 8 to 12 inch depth. And this is done within the critical root zone. The holes are then filled with topsoil or a mixture of topsoil and compost. And the idea is that you're creating new rooting areas. You're adding additional nutrients. You're increasing water and air infiltration. And this can also be used around young and mature trees. Radial trenching entails digging shallow trenches extending out from the tree, at least to the drip line. And this sort of looks like if you're looking from a top view, like a wagon spokes. And the depth of the trench is really going to vary with soil compaction. And you can extract the soil with an air spade to prevent root damage. And then you backfill with either the original soil, or you can mix in a topsoil with a little bit of compost and add that back into the trenches. And the ideas or the objectives of this are similar to vertical mulching. And again, this can be used with young and mature trees. Lastly, rototilling can be used to address some surface compaction issues, but it can also create a hard pan, which is a hardened layer about 6 to 8 inches under the soil. And this method needs to be used prior to planting trees or well outside of the root zone because it'll damage roots. And then addressing deep compaction, you can use some heavy equipment to do this, a subsoiler, common farm implement, or do something called soil profile rebuilding. And I have the specifications listed here. And I wanted to go into that in a little more detail. So though variations of this technique have been used for some time, Dr. Susan Day, some of you may know, of the University of British Columbia researched and refined this rehabilitation technique as a means of improving soil condition and tree establishment and growth following construction primarily. And so what they found is that this method decreases compaction and bulk density and increases water infiltration, carbon storage, and tree growth. And so this technique should be implemented after all construction is completed. And the method is really helpful for sites where the surface of the soil is graded subsoil or where the topsoil has been mostly removed or totally removed. And it can be carried out over a variety of areas. A 10 by 15 foot area, it can be carried out over the entire planting area. In a project that I was involved with, for one tree, we did this method on a 10 by 15 foot area. For 2 trees, a 10 to 15 foot by 25 foot area, we worked the soil. And note that this area is not appropriate around mature trees. So let's see, so this occurs after construction. I went through some of these steps, and the steps follow in this order. So you add 4 inches of finished compost over the soil, and then using a tractor, I can't remember the name of these tractors on wheels, so I'm just not even going to try to remember that. But something similar to this that has like a front end loader or scoop on it. So with the subsoil, you want to use a backhoe to a 2 foot depth over a large area, and then you sort of scoop and drop the soil back into the hole. So to a 2 foot depth, and then you return 3 to 4 inches of topsoil over the area, and then rototill that in, and then you let it settle. And you let it settle for several days or weeks before you plant, and then you plant and mulch the area to protect it. So it's a really great technique. I've seen the success of it in tree growth and soil quality, so definitely something worth exploring more. So it's really important to protect soil, not just the trees, during construction. And so this is going to be the second recommendation we talk about. And this is especially true where plants or other natural areas are going to be reestablished post-construction. So it's costly and time consuming to ameliorate damaged soil. So protecting it in the first place is really the best plan. Since some of the worst damage to trees can occur during construction, especially to the roots, this is especially important. So some recommendations during construction are creating these tree protection zones, which is also protecting the soil. We have an example here. You can see that there wasn't much protected here. As canopy, you kind of want to go out to the drip line or extend this area further, but I guess they did what they could. But definitely going out to the critical root zone if possible. And then defining and designating these entry and exit ways for construction and heavy equipment coming in and out, so the compaction is confined to one area. Consulting with an arborist or have an arborist work with a contractor to carry out, including sort of soil protection, root protection into the construction plans and specifications, and also mulching sensitive areas to reduce the impact on the soil. This can kind of spread out the impact of heavy equipment or materials that are being stored. So definitely protection zones are really important during construction. In general, it's just good to protect around trees. So for example, not parking under trees, covering the soil with mulch helps prevent helps reduce compaction and also prevent some crusting that can happen. And also being wise with use of equipment and having those paths coming in and out of a job site. So arborists bringing out heavy equipment to in tree removal or tree work, just being careful about using these pneumatic tires or low pressure tires, distributing the weight over a broader area with those tires, but then having a really defined location that those vehicles are going to be when the work is being conducted. So you may have to put barriers up to keep vehicles or people out of certain areas, or putting mulch down, again, really helps protect the soil, which then protects the trees. And so we have a few examples here of, this is in Athens, Georgia, putting up barriers to keep people from walking in these areas. And then mulch to protect the soil around this planting bed. Okay, so we wanted to talk next about soil volume. And Marissa, let me know about my time here. I have a timer on, so I just want to make sure I don't run over too much. Okay, so tree roots need room to mine for water and nutrients and safely support the weight and the movement of the tree, okay? Also, to realize the many benefits shade trees provide, they need to reach a mature size, but this isn't possible if the rooting area is restricted. So urban and suburban settings, trees are often provided an insufficient volume of soil to grow in. I'm sure all of us have seen this and are familiar with it. So limited rooting areas can cause closely planted trees to compete for limiting resources during a drought, like water and nutrients. A limited rooting area can also provide an insufficient amount of surface soil to accumulate soil nutrients from amendments or obtain other soil benefits from these amendments. There's just not enough area to collect that organic matter. It can also limit the area that the tree can allow water to infiltrate into the roots. So let's look at this. We see a couple of images here of limited rooting area, noting this one. This is a 25-year-old oak parking lot in Georgia. Trees that were planted at the same time are about 5 times as large as this tree. So this is work from Jim Urban, and this graph here is looking at ultimate tree size, desired tree size, and we're looking at crown spread in square feet and trunk diameter in inches, and looking at the soil volume that's required to reach these sizes. And so we have this measured in cubic feet for the soil volume. And so let's look at an example. So if our desire is to have a 20-inch diameter tree, then we are going to have about 1,300 cubic feet of soil volume to support that tree reaching a 20-inch diameter. So let's see, just kind of visualize what that looks like. So this is actually about 1,350, but So imagine a tree being planted in here, and we're looking at a 3-foot depth. So those recommendations are within a 3-foot depth here. And so I have like a 15 by 30 foot planting area. If we want a soil volume area, if we want that tree to reach that 20-inch diameter and realize all the benefits that we know can come from urban trees. So we need to provide more space for the trees to grow if possible. So providing adequate soil volume is really important for a variety of reasons. It can contribute to shared root space. It can allow more infiltration of water, as we just talked about. And there's a lot of different infrastructure that can be erected to allow this, like planting vaults and silva cells, suspended pavement, to just kind of increase, and we're talking about urban areas here, to increase the soil volume potential for trees, to give them more room to grow, to have the resources that they need to thrive. Okay, so here's just a couple examples. We'll move through these pictures. Examples of limited soil volume. See small planting areas, typical parking lot planting areas, again, very small. Just this, unless this is suspended pavement, these are really limited and will limit the growth of these trees over time. And then looking at some ideal situations here, there is a lot of shared root space. We have some permeable pavement here. This was a project in New Mexico, the Albuquerque Rapid Transit Project, and looking at some of these different options of permeable pavement, suspended pavement, and just seeing how they work and experimenting with them. And I think that, with over 80% of people living in urban and suburban areas, these scenarios may seem ideal, and I know there's a lot of restrictions, a lot of specifications urban suburban areas have to face, but my question for all of you is, how can we make this a reality? How can we actually grow these trees that we can realize these great benefits from, that help make our urban and suburban areas better places to live and work? Okay, so I'm just going to breeze through these because I don't want to run over my time here, but looking at some of these soil physical challenges. So crust amelioration, some recommendations for this are gently breaking up the crust and then covering the soil with mulch. This isn't necessarily for the salt crust that can happen in sodic soils, but other types of crusts that can happen from water droplet impacts. So mulch is really important for crust amelioration and prevention. The Caliche layer, I looked up a few recommendations in this publication at the bottom of the slide. If it's not thick, you can subsoil it and break it up. I don't have direct experience with that. Maybe some of you do. Some people, and I don't know if this is an up-to-date recommendation, will excavate into the Caliche layer, creating sort of a planting area of sorts. There's recommendations for dimensions of this, and it needs to have drain holes, and you can actually plant trees in it, apparently. Looking at some soil chemistry recommendations. So adjusting pH, definitely get a soil test, and test for what your pH is. And one way that you can do this in your own yard is you can test for free lime. You can actually pour vinegar on the soil, and if it fizzes, then you have free lime in your soil. You can adjust the soil with elemental sulfur, so this is bringing the pH down into a more desirable level. There's a recommendation here for how to do this. This is going to be based on your soil test results, though, so you definitely want soil test results before working with this. You can also just look at planting high pH tolerant tree species, and a lot of you are going to know those species better than I will. Adding compost or mulch helps lower the pH. And moving on, adding organic matter, increasing organic matter, I know is really beneficial for New Mexico soils. And adding this organic matter can be through addition of mulch, addition even of biochar. Biochar, through the research, has been found to be a little bit better for coarse textured or more sandy soils, and helping provide a surface to retain nutrients in the soil. So it works a lot like compost and mulch does. And again, you can apply these to the soil surface, or you can mix them into the soil. So looking at saline soils. So Saline soils, again, have this low sodium level, and soil tests you want to get are definitely electrical conductivity, the EC, and then the sodium adsorption ratio. So definitely ask for those. You also want to have the irrigation water tested, and I guess this depends on the area that you're working in, the size of the area that you're working in. You want the salinity to be lower than target for soil if you do have very saline soils and they're problematic. It takes time to reduce soil salinity, so be prepared for it to be a multi-year process. The soils must be well drained to remove the salts. So if you have a shallow caliche layer, it's going to be difficult to get those salts out of the soil and down into the soil profile away from the rooting zone. So it's important to flush the soil about 6 inches with water to reduce the salinity, and this takes a lot of water. So there's an example here, flushing 6 inches through the water. I left out the inch there. It takes about 163 gallons per 1,000 square feet. So it's going to take a lot of water, and it's going to take time to reduce the salinity in soils, but totally possible. In Sodic soils, again, you need a soil test to determine this. Tillage can help break up that crust layer and break up some of the, or help work with the structure. Really, one of the goals is you're trying to increase water infiltration. You want the water to come in and start to sort of flush those sodium ions out. And that water actually can have a higher saline content in it. Incorporating organic matter is really beneficial to these sodic soils, these high sodium soils. Adding gypsum is a key component of addressing sodic soils. And there's a table to the right that can provide some recommendations on this. Leaching the soil is going to be very similar to other types of saline soils. And so you will have to leach the soils to start to move that sodium out. And my very last slide is looking at some recommendations for improving soil drainage. So again, trees don't like wet feet. Most plants don't. There's a few that do, that can tolerate it, but most do not. So if we're looking at some different options here, there are permeable surfaces. We saw a few pictures of this. So permeable pavement. There's also some pavement that is a series of blocks that has cracks in it that can allow the water to infiltrate into the soil. There's filter and infiltration trenches. So these can be at the edges of parking lots. They can channel the water into these trenches that can then either be funneled away from the site to prevent waterlogging of the soil or the tree planting area, or they can funnel into sort of a holding container that the tree roots can access over time. And of course, that holding container will need to have an outlet pipe for overflow, so the trees aren't sitting in water for long periods of time. And there's also a variety of underground water storage systems that can be used in urban settings. So downspouts from buildings can funnel into these storage systems. There can be different types of storage systems that are under some of the silva cells or the suspended pavement systems that funnel water into a storage area for tree roots. And there's stormwater tree pits that funnel water in around the trees, but of course there has to be drainage areas for that water. So we're addressing stormwater issues, but we're also addressing the needs of the trees. And bioswales is another option where you have sort of a low area where water drains to. It's not really a pond, but it's sort of similar to that. So improving soil drainage really helps ameliorate a lot of the challenges that can come in urban and suburban areas with waterlogged soils and root aeration, and can really improve the quality and health of trees over time, and while helping with stormwater, reducing soil erosion, and trying to mitigate some soil pollution issues. So that's all I have. I wanted to take any questions that you may have. I did kind of move through my slides quickly, so if you want any clarifying pointers, I'm definitely willing to help. I have several resources listed here that I think are great to refer to for urban soils. There's many more than this, but these were some that I wanted to provide to you. And if anyone would like to contact me, ask any questions, I would love to take them.
Okay, hey, that was great, Holly. Thank you very much. We do have a set of questions that have come in, so I'm going to read those to you and see what kind of answers we can come up with. Are we ready?
Yeah,
So
I have one question. Was there another slide that needed to go up here?
there is a slide that will be going up. Margot is going to put that up. It's the CEU slide.
Okay, just checking.
So Margot,
All
I
right.
believe you have that in hand. All right, so I'm going through these questions, and these have been coming in throughout the talk, and then other attendees have kind of voted on which questions they want answered first. So I'm taking the ones with the most votes first. First question, I've heard that one should not add biochar to high pH soils. Is this true?
That's interesting. I actually don't know the answer to that question. Again, I don't live in high pH soils, so that's something I would have to get back to whoever asked the question, and it might be great if they could include their email address. I do have a colleague at the university that I'm at, and she's done a lot of research on biochar, and she could provide some information or feedback on the answer to that question. She spent a lot of time working in California, and so has a little bit more experience with higher pH soils than I do.
Okay. Hey, real quickly, can you go ahead and stop sharing your screen, and then Margot can put up the other thing there. Excellent.
So I'm jotting this down. Biochar good for, or bad for high pH soils.
Yeah, and I'll have to say I haven't heard that, but there's a lot I haven't heard, so it may well be. We had a couple of questions related to air spading, so I'm going to try to take them somewhat together here. How effective is an air spade in relieving compaction in the long term? The asker says that it only seems to help short term and must be repeated on a regular basis. Your thoughts?
That's interesting. There is, so the bulk density will start to increase over time. So there definitely is a reduction in the compaction around the tree. And then as the soil starts to settle, it does start to, I wouldn't say recompact necessarily unless you have a lot of foot traffic or equipment over the site. But I think
maybe if the compaction activities continue, then yes, it is going to recompact.
Oh, yes, definitely. I was involved, well, this isn't air spading, so I'll mention this in another comment if someone asks it, but
let me see if I can find that other air spade question real quick.
Yeah, but I would say, just sort of to your point, is yes, if the area isn't protected, maybe it doesn't have a good mulch cover over it after it's been air spaded, continues to get compaction related events or potential events, then yes, it would need to be done again. But I haven't heard that. I just know that the bulk density does start to increase over time, just as the soil is settling. Okay. So I think also it may be incorporating things like I was talking about adding compost in, or if the soil is really poor quality, adding some topsoil and mixing that in with the air spade. And so I don't know, the person who asked the question, I don't know if they were just air spading the existing soil or if they did work in some organic amendments which could help increase the quality and the health of the soil. Maybe that might be beneficial.
Okay. The follow-up question had to do with planting, now I can't find it again. The questions kind of jump around in place. Here we go. Would you recommend air spading a few years after planting young fruit trees after the roots have extended past the original hole and are now in the older sandy rocky soil but has not been compacted by foot traffic? So I guess they're asking about the value of air spading as a decompaction tool for poor soils but not compacted soils.
Yeah, and this starts to get into my experience with New Mexico soils, so you'll have to take this with a grain of salt. In okay soils here in Georgia, I'm just going to make a brief comparison. I definitely like to dig a really wide, not deep, but wide hole. We have a lot of compaction in our soils, and I would say I would recommend that first. Maybe this individual has actually done that for fruit trees or shade trees. Definitely as wide a hole as you can establish that tree in, the better. Now, if the tree seems like it's starting to decrease in growth, and it doesn't seem, I don't know, and maybe even have a side-by-side comparison, I would look at the growth of the tree and measure if you need to do additional soil work outside of that rooting zone. And adding mulch and compost is going to help, address that issue outside of the original rooting zone that you've planted in. But from my experience, air spading is expensive. And again, I'm not directly experienced with New Mexico soils and what you guys are challenged with as far as rocky soils. But I think air spading, I would go to other methods first. wide planting holes, add as much mulch as you can, and compost. And if it seems like the tree growth is reducing, then maybe that's when you go to a more costly option.
That's exactly what I was thinking. Mulch it, get some water into that mulch, give it time, and then see what needs to happen. Okay, different question. Where did that question go? How can I determine soil density in the field? Is there a quick and easy way to identify bulk density?
Bulk density or compaction?
Yeah.
So yeah, bulk density
is soil density in the field, but I think it does relate to compaction, right? So
yeah, and there are different measurements. So if you want to look at soil strength with a cone penetrometer, bulk density is a little bit of a process. You usually have a metal cone, a metal cylinder. It's being tapped into the soil. You're getting a undisturbed volume of soil, take it back to either your home or the lab, and you're heating it and weighing it and measuring volume. So there's a little process involved in bulk density measurement.
But field approximate. You're out on the site, you're looking at the soil. Is there any way? In the past, I've used one of those devices that you push down into the soil that has that little meter on it.
Yeah, that's the penetrometer. Yeah, I mean, if really the goal is to look for compaction, and compaction, bulk density is part of compaction, then I would say use a cone penetrometer. That is the easiest way, or another type of penetrometer. That's the easiest way to measure compaction in the field. Bulk density, yes, is a little bit more involved, and I don't know an easier way to do it except the way I learned how to do it in lab.
All right. Can you comment on the compaction that occurs before construction to support infrastructure as opposed to, and sorry, my screen keeps changing on me here, compared to soils that support good tree growth?
Yeah, sorry, can you read that one more time?
Yeah, let me find it here again. It keeps jumping on me. Can you comment on the compaction that occurs before construction to support infrastructure compared to soils that support root growth? And I guess that might be on the level of bulk density, or, new construction compact soils, trees need uncompacted soil. How do you bridge that?
Yeah, I don't have exact values for a difference between, soils that are compacted for construction, but we saw in those graphs that there's a root penetration limiting measurement, and it has to do with a fairly specific pressure value. And we saw also in another figure that on the construction site that most of the values of the soil down through the profile was well above that root penetration limiting value. And so there has to be some work to, if we want trees to grow to, their mature size and realize all the benefits of trees, we will have to do work to address that compaction. And it involves not just surface compaction, but deep compaction, adding removed topsoil. So in urban areas, and I'm not sure if I'm really addressing the question, but in urban areas where there is infrastructure that's going over planting areas, planting vaults even, where maybe there's some room for the tree roots to grow out beyond that vault underneath that heavily compacted soil for the, and I'm not talking about suspended pavement here, just a sort of a normal sidewalk construction. Tree roots will grow in it over time, but as we saw in those figures, it's a lot harder. The trees have to expend a lot more energy. They have less rooting area. They're not going to grow to the full potential that we would like them to. So amelioration techniques should happen if we want to have really nice trees.
Different sort of question here. What kind of impact does weed fabric have on soil?
You know, weed fabric, at least the weed fabric that I'm familiar with, is supposed to be permeable, not impermeable, permeable if it's the fabric and not plastic. And so water and air being allowed in and out of the soil can keep weed growth down, which can compete for nutrients. I don't like it though, because it prevents organic matter from being in contact with the soil. And
Love the answer.
Also, it's trash after it comes up and it falls apart. It blows around in your yard or in an urban or suburban area. And I would rather just weed and use mulch. Some people would rather use herbicides. I'm not a fan of it. It works for some people, but I'm not a fan of it, primarily because of the barrier between the soil and organic matter.
Yeah. Question about, explain how those sidewalks that support trees are built, please.
Oh gosh, I am not an expert in that technique or that engineering, but there are really great resources that can provide some specifications for how to do that. I know that there are some peers. There's a framework that's developed that the sidewalk would be built on top of, and sometimes there's structural soils that are used up underneath the suspended pavements, and sometimes it's the native soil that's infilled, but there's definitely a structure that's been engineered to hold the weight of that sidewalk, and some of that weight can be on some of the structural soil, but it's primarily like I want to say pier, but there's a support system there. But if you wanted more specifications, I would say reach out to me and I'll find some resources for you.
Another question then. Reclaimed water is very saline, but is required for use in irrigation in some municipal areas. What is the long-term consequence of using reclaimed water, given that high saline content?
Well, yeah, the high saline content combined with the high evaporation transpiration rate that could happen in climates like yours. And I would say that could be problematic over the long term. But again, I don't live in New Mexico and I don't manage water and soil there. But that to me sounds like it could be problematic. But I mean, are the municipalities, if that requirement does exist, are the municipalities measuring the salinity of the water?
That's a good question. I would assume somebody whoever's providing that water is probably monitoring that, and it is what it is. I will say there's an example here in Albuquerque in one of our city parks that's currently actually being redeveloped, but there was, it's a park that's on reclaimed water, and some of the trees in that park were lindens, and every year they would have tremendous salt burn on the leaf margins. They're just really intolerant. So part of that is maybe managing your species selection to that high salt level that you're gonna have.
Yeah, in the research that I was doing for this presentation, that is often what recommendations came to, is plant tolerant species, right tree, right place. And if you're right. If the reality is that the linden tree is in the wrong place for the application of high salinity water, then another species would probably be better selected for that area.
So here's a different kind of question. You may or may not be familiar with this, but we have cryptobiotic soil here in New Mexico, and that basically is a crust of a living algal-like life form. Is that an example of good crusting?
I saw that in my research, but I didn't read very deeply into it. Everything I read seemed to indicate that people shouldn't break it up.
Yeah.
And so that it was beneficial to the ecosystem, and so from an ecological perspective, it's best to maintain it.
I think that's a wonderful distinction between a living organic crust on a naturally undisturbed desert soil versus a physical crusting in an urban soil setting.
Yeah, and I guess it depends what someone is what are their management objectives for a soil. And if they're going to farm that area, again, I might be making wild assumptions here, then it could be that that crust is problematic. But from an ecological perspective, it probably has a host of benefits for that ecosystem and shouldn't be disrupted. At least that's what in my scanning of information about that, what I saw. Very
good. Just making sure, I think we have about 5 more minutes, so we'll get in a couple more questions. And then we do have a break during which time we ask our attendees to visit the sponsors' web pages. Here's a question. I understand trees near hospitals and schools have a calming influence on students and patients, correct? And that's the question. But it away from soils, but into that broader urban forestry context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's been some studies that have shown stress level reductions from trees and green space, and ability to pay attention better. There's a whole suite of health and well-being studies that support trees around schools and hospitals. You know, I've seen a lot of meditation gardens around hospitals, and there's an effort in Georgia to create more of those to provide space for children too to play. So it's a green space and then also a play structures. And the goal really is to provide the calm that comes from seeing green and gentle leaves blowing in the wind. And so, yes, definitely like a cortisol reduction is happening.
Last question, back to soils. I've heard of using scoria rock in space created by air spading for heavy traffic areas. Thoughts?
I'm not familiar with scoria rock. Is this something that
is a very porous volcanic rock?
Okay.
It's almost, it's got lots of internal pore space to it. And I guess it would kind of weight bear sort of like a structural soil, but have air holding and water holding capacity internal to its porous nature. Yeah,
I'm not as familiar with how quickly that kind of rock decomposes, and would it provide, I couldn't speak to more volcanic soils in that regard, but just the decomposition of it and what would be mixed with it. I understand the importance of structural soils. I'm not as much of a fan of them. I like the native soil, and especially with trees that are adapted to grow within the native soil. And it would depend what was blended with that rock, and if there was sufficient nutrient holding capacity of, the soil element that was added and blended. But I would agree, depending on the strength that rock could withstand, I guess that would be a value that would need to be evaluated is what is its weight bearing capacity? Would it crush? Could it support the weight of that type of infrastructure? And then also provide space for soils to provide, benefits to trees.
Right. Great. Well, Holly, your presentation was wonderful. Thank you so very much. One of my favorite topics. I think a lot of people don't really understand soils, and they're not easy to understand, and you helped us a lot. So thank you.
You're welcome.
We have the ISA and the LA CEU codes up on the screen. And at this point, Marisa, do I turn the proceedings back to you?
No.
Okay.
We are just going to go to break, and then so you'll go back to agenda and then click on the next session when we start that in about 15 minutes.
Okay,
16.
so 15-minute break, time to go to the potty, have another cup of coffee, and we'll see you guys back here in about 15 minutes.
Thanks.